Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into a quiet and slightly strange corner of ancient history, a place where dusty manuscripts sit in monasteries, candles flicker against stone walls, and monks patiently copy old stories that most of the world has never heard about. So if you're lying in bed right now, maybe dim the lights a little, relax your shoulders, take a slow breath, and just let the story wander slowly along tonight. Because tonight we are talking about a version of the Bible that most people never read. A tradition that quietly preserved ancient texts for centuries, while the rest of the world was busy arguing about doctrine and translations. And hidden inside those pages are unusual expansions of the story of Adam and Eve, especially the mysterious creation of Eve herself. Now the short version of the story is familiar to almost everyone. According to Genesis, God forms Adam from dust, places him in the Garden of Eden, notices that Adam is alone, and then creates Eve from one of Adam's ribs while Adam is asleep. It is a very short story, almost suspiciously short for something that supposedly explains the beginning of humanity. Ancient readers noticed that too, because ancient people loved details, and when details were missing, they usually started filling in the blanks themselves. And that is exactly what happened across many early Jewish and Christian traditions. One of the places where those expanded traditions survived the longest is Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church developed one of the largest biblical canons in the world, containing more books than most Western Bibles. In many cases, those books preserved older traditions that had slowly disappeared elsewhere. And among those texts are writings that expand the story of Adam and Eve in ways that are sometimes poetic, sometimes strange, and occasionally a little awkward in the way ancient storytelling often is. One of the most important of these texts is something called the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees is basically a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, but with additional commentary and explanations. Imagine someone taking the original Bible story and saying, "Yes, that happened, but let me explain what was really going on in the background." According to Jubilees, the timeline of creation becomes much more precise than the brief description in Genesis. Adam is still created first, formed from the dust of the earth. The Garden of Eden is still described as a beautiful place filled with rivers, trees, and peaceful animals. But Jubilees adds a curious little detail. Adam apparently lived alone in the garden for 40 days before Eve was created. 40 days is one of those symbolic numbers that appears constantly in biblical tradition. Flood rains last 40 days, prophets fast for 40 days, and apparently the first human also spent 40 days walking around paradise alone before things became slightly less lonely. During that time, Adam is described as learning about the animals and naming every living creature, which sounds peaceful enough. But if you think about it for a moment, it also means Adam was watching animals arrive in pairs everywhere he looked. 2 birds, 2 deer, 2 sheep, 2 goats, 2 of everything. Meanwhile, Adam was still by himself. Ancient storytellers quietly suggested that Adam eventually noticed this pattern. Every creature had a companion except him, which must have felt a little awkward even in paradise. Eventually, according to the story, God decides the situation should probably be fixed. Adam falls asleep and the famous rib moment happens. But Jubilees adds another twist. Eve is not immediately placed into the garden with Adam. Instead, the text suggests she was created outside the garden first and brought inside later after a short period of purification. This small detail created centuries of discussion among ancient readers, because it raised a simple but interesting question. What exactly was happening during that waiting period? Ancient religious writers loved ceremonial explanations, so many of them imagined Eve's entrance into the garden as something almost like the world's first wedding introduction. Adam wakes up, sees Eve, and immediately announces that she is bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh, which is a beautiful line of poetry. Although if you imagine the situation realistically, it is also a little funny. Adam wakes up from what must have been a very strange nap, sees a completely new person standing nearby, and instantly begins speaking in poetic metaphors. Ancient storytelling did not worry too much about realism. It cared more about meaning. and the meaning behind the rib story became important to many later writers. Some believed the ribs symbolized equality because it came from Adam's side rather than his head or his feet. Others believed it symbolized unity, the idea that the first humans were originally one body divided into two parts. A few theologians even argued that the rib symbolized protection because ribs guard the heart. Ancient interpreters loved symbolic explanations like that. But the Ethiopian tradition preserved even longer expansions of the Adam and Eve story. One of the most unusual texts is known as the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. This text survives mainly in Ethiopian manuscripts and describes the life of Adam and Eve after leaving the garden. The story becomes much longer and much stranger. Adam and Eve wander through the wilderness, live inside a cave, speak with angels, and occasionally argue with Satan himself. It reads almost like an ancient epic, slowly unfolding one quiet scene at a time. According to these traditions, the early days of humanity were filled with confusion and discovery. Adam and Eve were not immediately wise about the world. They had to learn slowly. They studied plants, animals, weather, and seasons. Some stories even claim angels were sent to teach them basic knowledge about how the world worked, which makes the beginning of human history sound a bit like an orientation program for the entire species. And during those early days, Eve's creation remained a subject of constant reflection. Writers wondered why she was created differently from Adam. Adam came from dust. Eve came from Adam. That difference fascinated ancient thinkers for centuries. Some believed it represented the deep connection between man and woman. Others believed it symbolized the beginning of human community. And some writers simply tried to explain the strange moment when Adam was asleep and Eve was formed from his side. Because the Bible itself moves through that scene very quickly. Adam sleeps, the rib is taken, Eve appears, and the story keeps moving. But curious readers always want more details. What did that moment actually look like? Was it quiet? Were angels involved? Did Adam dream during that sleep? Ancient writers imagined many possibilities. And over time those ideas turned into entire stories that circulated in different parts of the ancient world. Some were eventually forgotten. Others survived quietly inside Ethiopian manuscripts, where monks carefully preserved them for centuries. So tonight, as we slowly drift through this history, we are really exploring the imagination of ancient storytellers. People who looked at a very short biblical passage and decided it needed a much longer explanation. They filled the empty spaces with symbolism, speculation, and gentle storytelling about the earliest days of humanity. And strangely enough, the story becomes even more complicated once we move beyond the moment of Eve's creation. Because the next question ancient readers asked was simple but very important. What exactly was happening during Adam's life before Eve arrived? And the answers they created are sometimes far stranger than the rib story itself. So the next question ancient readers kept asking was a quiet but persistent one. What exactly was Adam doing during those early days before Eve appeared? Genesis moves past that moment very quickly, almost like someone skipping over the first chapter of a long story. Adam exists, animals appear, and then Eve arrives. But the Ethiopian traditions, along with several other ancient texts, slow that moment down and stretch it out like a long quiet afternoon. According to the expanded traditions, Adam's first days in the Garden of Eden were not filled with excitement or adventure. Instead, they were slow and peaceful, almost dreamlike. Adam walked through trees that had never been touched, rivers that had never been crossed, and fields where animals moved without fear. It was paradise in the most literal sense, calm, balanced, and strangely quiet. And Adam, according to these traditions, spent much of that time observing the world around him. Ancient writers often imagined Adam as something like the first student in history. The garden was his classroom. Every tree, river, and animal was a lesson waiting to be understood. One tradition claims angels were sent to guide him, teaching him about the plants that produced fruit and the ones that produced shade. Another suggests Adam slowly discovered the rhythm of day and night, watching the sky change colors as the sun moved across the horizon. For someone who had just been created from dust a few days earlier, it must have been a lot to take in. But the strangest part of these traditions comes from the idea that Adam was naming the animals during this time. Now, naming animals sounds simple at first, but imagine the situation for a moment. Every creature in the world walking past Adam one by one while he tried to invent names for them. Birds flying overhead, deer wandering through grass, insects buzzing near flowers. It must have been a very long process. And the stories suggest Adam took it seriously. Because in ancient thinking, names were powerful things. Naming something meant understanding its nature. So Adam observed each animal carefully before deciding what to call it. The lion received a name that reflected strength. The dove received a name that suggested peace. The snake, of course, received a name that would later become slightly unfortunate for everyone involved. And as Adam watched the animals pass by, he began noticing something interesting. They arrived in pairs. 2 birds perched together on branches. 2 gazelles drinking from the same riverbank. 2 wolves moving through the grass side by side. Everywhere Adam looked, there were pairs of creatures moving through the garden together. And slowly a quiet realization began forming in Adam's mind. He was the only one walking alone. Now ancient writers like to imagine Adam's reaction to this discovery. Some texts describe him feeling puzzled rather than sad. After all, he had only existed for a short time. Loneliness might not have been a concept he fully understood yet. But he clearly noticed the difference. Every animal had a companion that looked like it. Adam did not. According to one tradition, Adam even asked the angels about it. Why do they all have partners? And the angels supposedly answered with a calm and mysterious response. Your companion will come in time, which sounds reassuring, but also slightly vague in the way ancient angelic messages often are. Meanwhile, Adam continued wandering through the garden, naming animals and learning about the world. Some traditions say he also learned about the rivers of Eden, the 4 great streams that flowed from the garden into the lands beyond. He followed their paths, watched fish swim through clear water, and listened to the sound of wind moving through leaves. In many ways, it was the calmest period of human history that would ever exist. No cities, no wars, no kings arguing over borders, just one human being quietly exploring paradise. But even paradise can start to feel incomplete after a while. And the stories suggest God eventually noticed Adam's solitude. The famous line appears in Genesis saying it is not good for man to be alone, which is one of those moments where the text quietly admits something about human nature. Even in a perfect garden filled with food and beauty, companionship still matters. So according to the tradition, Adam is guided into a deep sleep. Not an ordinary sleep, but something closer to a sacred trance. Ancient writers imagined angels standing nearby while this happened, watching the moment when the first human body was gently opened and the rib was taken. Some stories describe the rib glowing with divine light. Others say it was transformed directly into Eve by the creative power of God. The details vary depending on the storyteller, but the basic idea remains the same. From Adam's side, a second human being begins to take shape. And according to several Ethiopian traditions, this process was not instantaneous. Eve's creation unfolded gradually, almost like a careful work of art. The texts sometimes describe her being formed outside the garden first, shaped from Adam's rib, but given life separately before being brought to him. Which might sound like a strange detail, but ancient thinkers often liked symbolic steps like this. It gave the story a sense of ceremony, a beginning, a preparation, and then the moment of introduction. And eventually that introduction arrives. Adam wakes from his deep sleep and sees Eve for the first time. The moment is described in very simple language. Adam immediately recognizes that she is connected to him in some profound way. Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. It is one of the earliest poetic lines in human literature. And ancient readers loved reflecting on what that moment must have felt like. Imagine opening your eyes after a long sleep and discovering another person standing beside you who shares your very nature. Someone who looks similar but also different in ways you have never seen before. According to some traditions, Adam laughed with joy. Others say he simply stood there quietly in amazement. Either way, the two humans were no longer alone, and the peaceful life of the garden continued for a time. Adam and Eve explored together, walked through orchards, and watched animals moving peacefully around them. The Ethiopian stories often emphasize this calm period before anything went wrong. It was a time of learning and discovery. Adam showed Eve the rivers and the trees he had already explored. Eve learned the names of animals that Adam had invented, and the two of them slowly began understanding the strange new experience of human companionship. Of course, ancient storytellers knew the calm would not last forever, because eventually the story must arrive at the famous moment with the forbidden tree. But the Ethiopian tradition often slows the story down before that moment arrives. It lingers on the quiet days when humanity still lived in innocence. Adam and Eve walking through gardens, learning the rhythms of the world, unaware that history was about to take a very complicated turn. And the most interesting detail preserved in some Ethiopian manuscripts is the idea that Eve herself was deeply curious about the garden. She asked questions constantly. Why do some trees produce fruit while others produce shade? Why do birds sing in the morning but grow quiet at night? Curiosity is a beautiful trait. But as many ancient storytellers quietly noted, curiosity can also lead people into situations they never expected. And somewhere in the peaceful garden, not very far from Adam and Eve, another creature was watching their curiosity very carefully. Because in the next part of the story, the quiet garden will receive a visitor who enjoys asking questions almost as much as Eve does. And that visitor, as most of us already know, is a serpent with a very interesting conversation planned. And so the peaceful rhythm of the garden continued for a while, calm days flowing into calm evenings, Adam and Eve wandering beneath trees that had never known decay, animals moving through the grass without fear, rivers running quietly through the center of paradise. According to many of the Ethiopian traditions, this period of peace may have lasted longer than the brief Genesis narrative suggests, because ancient storytellers often imagined the first humans spending a meaningful amount of time learning about their surroundings before anything dramatic happened. Adam had already explored much of the garden during his early days alone, and now he showed Eve the places he had discovered earlier, the wide riverbanks where animals gathered to drink, the orchards where fruit hung heavy on branches, and the shaded paths where cool breezes moved through tall trees. Eve listened carefully and asked many questions because curiosity seemed to be one of her strongest qualities, according to several ancient texts, and curiosity itself was not considered a bad thing in these early traditions. It was simply part of being human. Eve wanted to understand how the garden worked, why the rivers flowed in certain directions, why some trees produced fruit while others grew only leaves, and Adam did his best to answer, even though he himself was still learning about the world. Sometimes the answers came from observation, sometimes from the quiet guidance of angels who, according to some traditions, still visited the garden during those early days, offering gentle instruction to the first human pair. In this peaceful setting, the famous command about the forbidden tree also existed, though ancient storytellers sometimes explained it in more detail than Genesis does. God had given Adam a simple instruction before Eve was created, telling him that the garden contained many trees whose fruit could be eaten freely, but one tree in the center was not meant to be touched or consumed. The reason for the command was not always explained clearly, which naturally encouraged centuries of interpretation later on, but the command itself was simple enough to remember. Everything in the garden was available except for that one particular tree. Adam eventually shared this instruction with Eve, explaining that they should simply avoid it and enjoy the rest of paradise. For a while that arrangement worked perfectly well, because the garden was large and full of wonders that easily distracted attention away from a single forbidden tree. But curiosity, once again, tends to wander toward the very thing it is told to ignore. And somewhere in the quiet garden another creature had been observing the first humans very carefully. In the traditional Genesis story, this creature appears suddenly as a serpent, but ancient interpretations sometimes describe the serpent as more than just an ordinary animal. Some texts suggested it had once been a beautiful creature, capable of walking upright, before its role in the story changed forever. Others believed it represented a spiritual being speaking through an animal form. The Ethiopian text known as the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan goes even further, describing the serpent as part of a larger attempt by Satan to deceive the first humans after being cast out of heaven. Whatever interpretation one prefers, the result in the story remains the same. A serpent eventually approaches Eve and begins a conversation. Now it is worth noting that ancient readers often found this moment less shocking than modern readers do. In the symbolic storytelling of the ancient world, animals speaking in stories was not particularly unusual. The real importance of the scene lies in the conversation itself. According to the narrative, the serpent begins not with threats or commands, but with a question. And questions have always been powerful tools in human history. The serpent asks Eve whether it is true that God forbade them from eating any fruit in the garden. Eve quickly corrects the statement because that is not what Adam told her. They may eat fruit from every tree except one, the tree in the center of the garden. And the serpent listens carefully before offering a slightly different interpretation of the rule. The serpent suggests that eating from the tree will not lead to death as Eve believes, but instead will open their eyes and grant them knowledge similar to divine beings. This is where ancient writers began offering many interpretations of what exactly the forbidden tree represented. Some believed it symbolized moral awareness, the moment when humans first understood the difference between good and evil. Others believed it represented wisdom that humanity was not yet ready to possess. A few even suggested the tree symbolized independence, the first step toward humans deciding things for themselves, rather than simply following instructions. Eve listens to the serpent's argument and begins looking at the tree more carefully. The fruit appears beautiful and desirable, and the promise of knowledge is tempting to someone whose natural curiosity already drives her to ask questions about everything she sees. Ancient storytellers often emphasize this quiet moment of decision rather than the act itself, because the choice represents the beginning of human freedom. Eventually, Eve takes the fruit and eats it, and then shares it with Adam, who is nearby. The story moves quickly at this point, because the consequences begin unfolding immediately. According to Genesis, their eyes are opened, and they suddenly realize they are naked, something that had not previously concerned them. Ancient interpreters saw this as the moment when innocence gave way to self-awareness. Adam and Eve cover themselves with leaves and begin experiencing emotions they had never felt before: uncertainty, embarrassment, and fear. Soon after this moment, they hear the sound of God moving through the garden, and rather than greeting the familiar presence with calm curiosity, they hide among the trees. This reaction alone tells the reader that something in the relationship between humanity and the divine has changed. The following conversation between God, Adam, and Eve is described very briefly in Genesis, but expanded more fully in some later traditions. Adam admits that he hid because he was afraid, which leads to the famous question about whether he has eaten from the forbidden tree. The answer reveals the chain of events. Adam explains that Eve gave him the fruit, and Eve explains that the serpent deceived her. Ancient storytellers sometimes commented on this moment with gentle irony, because it marks one of the earliest examples of humans shifting responsibility in difficult situations. The story then moves toward the consequences that follow the decision. The serpent receives a curse that condemns it to crawl on the ground. Eve receives the prediction of pain and hardship in human life, and Adam learns that the easy abundance of the garden will give way to labor and struggle in the outside world. Finally, Adam and Eve are sent away from the garden itself, beginning the long human journey through history beyond paradise. Yet the Ethiopian traditions often continued the story after this point, rather than ending it abruptly. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, The first human pair struggled deeply after leaving Eden, trying to understand the new world they now inhabited. They lived in caves, prayed for forgiveness, and experienced the harshness of a life where food required effort and survival demanded patience. Angels occasionally appeared to guide them, reminding them that despite their mistake, humanity still had a place within the larger plan of creation. And Eve, the woman whose curiosity had once led her to speak with a serpent beneath a forbidden tree, remained an important figure in these traditions, because she represented both the beginning of human error and the beginning of human experience. Through Eve, the ancient storytellers explained how humanity first encountered knowledge, responsibility, and the complicated freedom of making choices. And as we continue drifting through the Ethiopian traditions surrounding Adam and Eve, the story will grow even stranger, because the lives of the first humans after Eden involve visions, prophecies, encounters with angels, and long reflections on what their descendants might become. The quiet garden may be gone, but the story of humanity has only just begun. And so Adam and Eve stepped beyond the quiet boundaries of Eden and entered a world that suddenly felt much larger, rougher, and far less predictable than the garden they had known before. According to several Ethiopian traditions, the moment they left the garden was not dramatic, in the way modern stories might describe it. There were no thunderclaps or blazing storms, just a slow realization that the land outside Eden required effort in ways paradise never had. The ground was harder, the air colder at night, and food no longer appeared conveniently on branches wherever they walked. Ancient storytellers often imagined Adam and Eve standing together at the edge of the garden, looking back at the place where their life had begun, quietly understanding that they could not return. In the text known as the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, this moment begins a long period of confusion and reflection for the first humans. Adam in particular is described as deeply troubled by what had happened, sometimes sitting for long periods in silence while trying to understand why their mistake had changed everything so quickly. Eve also struggled with regret according to these traditions, though the stories rarely present her as a villain the way some later interpretations did. Instead, she is portrayed as thoughtful and reflective, realizing that curiosity had led her into a conversation she did not fully understand. Together, Adam and Eve began learning how to survive in a world where life required work. They gathered food from the land, built simple shelters, and slowly discovered which plants could be eaten safely and which ones caused illness. Some traditions describe them living inside a cave for a time, a quiet shelter that protected them from wind and rain during the early years outside Eden. The cave appears frequently in Ethiopian storytelling about Adam and Eve because it symbolizes humanity's first attempt to create a home in a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And during these difficult early years, the texts often describe angels visiting Adam and Eve occasionally, offering guidance and reminding them that despite their mistake, they had not been abandoned completely. One story claims that an angel showed Adam how to grow crops by planting seeds in the soil and waiting patiently for them to grow. Another tradition suggests angels taught Eve how to prepare food and care for the small animals that began living near their shelter. These moments of instruction helped the first humans slowly adapt to their new environment. But the Ethiopian texts also include another unusual element that appears repeatedly in the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. According to this narrative, Satan continued attempting to deceive or harm the first humans even after they left the garden. Several episodes describe Satan appearing in different forms, sometimes trying to frighten them and other times attempting to trick them again with false promises. Adam and Eve learned to recognize these attempts over time and began resisting them, which ancient writers interpreted as the beginning of human wisdom. Through experience and hardship, the first humans slowly became stronger and more aware of the dangers around them. During these years, Adam and Eve also began thinking about the future of humanity. If they were the first two humans in the world, then every generation that followed would come from them. That idea must have felt both hopeful and heavy at the same time. According to several Ethiopian manuscripts, Adam spent many nights praying and asking for guidance about the future of their descendants. In response, some traditions say angels showed Adam visions of what humanity might become in the centuries ahead. These visions were not always clear or detailed, but they suggested that humanity's story would be long and complicated, filled with both kindness and cruelty, wisdom and mistakes. Adam reportedly shared these visions with Eve during quiet evenings near their shelter, describing glimpses of cities, families, and distant generations that had not yet been born. These stories served as a reminder that the human journey did not end with their mistake in the garden. It was only beginning. As time passed, Adam and Eve eventually began raising children, marking the start of the first human family. Their sons and daughters learned about the world through the experiences of their parents, listening to stories about the garden they had never seen and the lessons learned from leaving it. According to tradition, Eve became especially devoted to teaching her children about patience and responsibility, perhaps remembering the moment when curiosity had led her toward the forbidden tree. The family grew, and the first generations of humanity slowly spread across the land beyond Eden. But even as new lives appeared, the memory of the garden remained strong in Adam and Eve's minds. Some evenings they would speak quietly about the peaceful days before their mistake, remembering the rivers, the fruit trees, and the calm beauty of the place where they had first met. These reflections were not always filled with sadness. Sometimes they simply served as reminders of how much the world had changed. Ancient Ethiopian storytellers often presented these later years of Adam and Eve as calm and thoughtful rather than dramatic. The first humans were no longer wandering through paradise or facing sudden temptation. Instead, they were living ordinary lives filled with work, family, and quiet reflection about the past. And in many ways, that slow and steady life became the true beginning of human history. Because everything that followed, every civilization, every kingdom, every story told across thousands of years, would eventually trace its origins back to those two figures who once walked through the Garden of Eden. The Ethiopian traditions preserve this long reflection on the lives of Adam and Eve because they believed the story of humanity's beginning did not end with the forbidden fruit. It continued through the years that followed, through the lessons learned outside the garden, and through the generations that grew from the first human family. And as these traditions continued being copied by monks and scholars across centuries, they quietly carried forward a message that ancient storytellers often repeated. The story of Eve's creation and the events that followed were not simply about a mistake. They were about the beginning of human experience itself. Curiosity, choice, consequence, learning, and growth all appeared for the first time in those early chapters of the human story. And the Ethiopian manuscripts preserved those ideas with unusual patience, expanding the brief Genesis narrative into a long reflection on what it meant to be human in a world that was no longer perfect, but still full of possibility. And so life outside the garden slowly settled into a quiet rhythm for Adam and Eve, a rhythm that looked very different from the effortless days they once knew in Eden, but eventually became familiar in its own way. The ground demanded work now. Seeds had to be planted and waited for. Rain sometimes came late, and the wind could be cold at night. But the first humans were learning, slowly and patiently, how to live in a world that required effort. And according to several Ethiopian traditions, this was also the time when their family began to grow. The story of Adam and Eve becomes less about two individuals and more about the beginning of humanity itself, because their children would become the ancestors of every generation that followed. Ancient texts describe Eve giving birth to sons and daughters over many years, and the first of these children are the famous brothers Cain and Abel. Now, even in the calm storytelling style of these traditions, the story of Cain and Abel carries a quiet sense of tension, because it represents the first moment when human relationships become complicated in ways Adam and Eve may not have expected. Cain grew up learning the work of the land from his father, planting seeds and harvesting crops from the soil that Adam had slowly learned to cultivate. Abel, on the other hand, became a keeper of animals, guiding flocks across open fields and learning how to care for sheep and goats. Both brothers worked hard in their own ways, but their personalities were described differently by many ancient storytellers. Abel is usually portrayed as calm and thoughtful, someone who moved quietly through the fields and took pride in caring for his animals. Cain is sometimes described as more intense, more serious about his work, perhaps even a little frustrated by the constant effort required to grow food from stubborn soil. These differences may have seemed small at first, but ancient writers often believed that human conflicts begin with small feelings that slowly grow larger over time. According to the story, both brothers eventually made offerings to God as a way of honoring the Creator who had shaped their world. Abel offered the best animals from his flock, while Cain brought crops from the fields he had worked so carefully. The reason for what happened next has been debated by scholars and storytellers for centuries. The narrative simply says that Abel's offering was accepted while Cain's was not. Some traditions suggested Abel's gift showed deeper devotion. Others believed Cain may have offered something less carefully chosen. But the text itself does not explain the decision clearly, which left generations of readers trying to understand the moment. What the story does describe clearly is Cain's reaction. He became angry and deeply discouraged, emotions that Adam and Eve had likely seen before in small ways, but never in such intensity. According to the narrative, God spoke to Cain directly, warning him that anger could lead him down a dangerous path if he allowed it to grow. The advice was simple but wise. Master your feelings rather than letting them control you. Unfortunately, the story suggests Cain did not follow that advice. Instead, the quiet tension between the brothers continued building until one day they went out into the fields together. The events that followed became one of the earliest tragedies recorded in human storytelling. In a moment of anger, Cain attacked Abel and killed him, marking the first act of violence in the long history of humanity. Even ancient writers who told this story in calm tones often paused here for a moment, because the scene represents a turning point in the human story. Adam and Eve had once lived in a world without fear or harm. Now their own children had introduced something entirely new into human experience. When the story continues, God confronts Cain and asks where his brother is, a question that Cain answers with a line that would echo through history. Am I my brother's keeper? It is a strange response because the answer, at least in the moral logic of the story, is clearly yes. Humans are responsible for one another in ways that Cain had chosen to ignore. As a result, Cain is sent away to wander the earth, carrying the consequences of his actions with him. Ancient Ethiopian traditions sometimes describe Adam and Eve reacting to this tragedy with deep sorrow, realizing that the world outside Eden had grown even more complicated than they had imagined. Yet even after this painful moment, the story of their family continued. Other children were born, including a son named Seth, who would eventually carry forward the family line. Through Seth, the generations of humanity continued spreading across the earth, forming communities and developing the early foundations of civilization. In these traditions, Adam and Eve lived long enough to see many of their descendants grow into adulthood, which must have been a strange experience for the first human pair. Imagine watching the human population expand from 2 individuals to dozens and then hundreds over the course of a lifetime. According to some ancient texts, Adam became something like a teacher to the growing generations, explaining the history of the garden and the lessons learned from leaving it. Eve also remained an important figure within the early family, remembered not only as the first woman but as someone who helped guide the earliest human community through its first difficult years. The Ethiopian manuscripts often emphasize that despite the mistakes and tragedies that occurred, the human story did not stop moving forward. Each generation learned something new, built something different, and carried pieces of the past into the future. And through it, all the memory of the garden remained a quiet presence in the background of human history, a reminder of where the journey had begun and how far humanity had traveled since those early days. For Adam and Eve themselves, the later years of life were described as calm and reflective. They had seen paradise and exile, joy and sorrow, beginnings and consequences. They had watched their children shape the early chapters of human history in ways both hopeful and painful. And as they grew older, They often spoke about the importance of wisdom and patience, lessons that had taken them a lifetime to understand. The Ethiopian storytellers preserved these reflections because they believed the story of the first humans was not only about the past. It was also about the ongoing experience of every generation that followed. Curiosity, choices, mistakes, forgiveness, learning, and growth all began in those earliest chapters of human history. And in the quiet traditions preserved by Ethiopian monks and scholars, those chapters continued expanding into thoughtful reflections about what it meant to live in a world shaped by both human freedom and human responsibility. And even after the long lives of Adam and Eve finally came to an end, the questions their story raised about knowledge, temptation, and human nature would continue echoing through history for thousands of years. And as the years continued passing quietly, the lives of Adam and Eve slowly moved toward their final chapters. Though according to many ancient traditions, those chapters were surprisingly long. Several early texts suggest that Adam lived for more than 900 years, which might sound impossible to modern ears, but was often used in ancient storytelling as a way of showing the closeness between the earliest humans and the original moment of creation. The idea was that the first generations lived longer because they stood closer to the beginning of the world itself. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the long lifespan gave Adam and Eve plenty of time to watch humanity slowly unfold around them. Their family had grown far beyond the small circle of children they once raised in the early days after leaving Eden. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and entire communities of descendants now lived across the land, building simple homes, raising animals, and learning the rhythms of farming that Adam had discovered through patient trial and error. According to Ethiopian traditions, Adam often spent his later years sharing stories with these younger generations, explaining how the world had begun and what life inside the garden had once been like. The stories must have sounded almost mythical to the listeners, because paradise was something none of them had ever seen. They heard descriptions of rivers that never dried up, trees that produced fruit without cultivation, and animals that lived peacefully without fear of one another. To the children of later generations, Eden probably sounded less like a real place and more like a distant dream from a forgotten age. Eve also remained an important storyteller during these years, though her reflections sometimes carried a slightly different tone. According to several traditions, she spoke honestly about the moment of temptation in the garden and the consequences that followed. Rather than hiding the story, she treated it as a lesson for her descendants, reminding them that curiosity and desire could lead people into choices they might regret later. But the Ethiopian manuscripts rarely portray Eve as permanently burdened by guilt. Instead, they present her as someone who learned from experience and used that wisdom to guide the growing human family. In these stories, she becomes less a symbol of failure and more a symbol of understanding, someone who recognized how fragile human decisions could be. As Adam grew older, the text suggests he began thinking often about the promise that humanity's story would continue long after his own life ended. Some traditions describe him receiving visions about the distant future of his descendants. In these visions, he reportedly saw generations rising and falling, cities appearing across the earth, and people searching for meaning in a world that had grown far more complex than the simple garden where everything began. The visions were not always clear, but they carried one consistent idea: that humanity's journey would be long and filled with both wisdom and mistakes. Adam shared these visions with his children and grandchildren during quiet evenings, encouraging them to remember that every generation would face its own choices and responsibilities. The Ethiopian texts sometimes describe these conversations happening near the cave where Adam and Eve had once lived during their early years outside Eden. The cave had become a symbolic place for the family, representing the moment when humanity first learned to survive in a challenging world. Sitting near its entrance, Adam would speak slowly, reflecting on the strange path his life had taken from dust to paradise, and then from paradise into the long unfolding story of human history. Eventually, the time came when Adam's life began reaching its natural end. According to ancient tradition, he gathered his family around him and offered final words of guidance. The advice was simple but thoughtful, reminding his descendants to respect one another, to care for the land that sustained them, and to remember the lessons learned from the earliest chapters of human history. Eve remained beside him during these final moments, the same companion who had once walked with him through the quiet paths of Eden so many centuries earlier. When Adam finally passed away, the story describes the family mourning deeply, not only for the loss of a father and ancestor, but for the passing of the first human being who had witnessed the beginning of everything they knew. Some Ethiopian traditions even claim angels were present during this moment, honoring the life of the man who had once walked in the garden at the dawn of creation. Eve lived for some time after Adam's death, according to several accounts, continuing to guide the family and remind younger generations about the importance of patience and wisdom. But eventually, her life also came to an end, closing the chapter of the first human pair who had begun the entire story. By that point, humanity had already spread across the surrounding lands, forming new communities and continuing the slow process of building civilization. The memory of Adam and Eve remained strong in those early generations because their lives represented the beginning of everything. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserved these stories with remarkable care, copying them across centuries inside monasteries where scribes worked quietly by candlelight. These texts were never meant to shock readers or reveal hidden conspiracies about creation. Instead, they were attempts to understand the earliest moments of human existence and the lessons that could be drawn from them. Through these expanded traditions, the story of Eve's creation became more than a short scene involving a rib and a sleeping man. It became part of a much longer reflection on curiosity, responsibility, and the complicated journey that began when the first human stepped beyond the garden and into the wider world. The Ethiopian storytellers believed that understanding those early chapters could help later generations think more carefully about their own choices. Because in many ways the questions raised by Adam and Eve's story never truly disappeared. Humans still wrestle with curiosity, temptation, knowledge, and the consequences of their decisions thousands of years later. And perhaps that is why these ancient texts continue attracting attention even today. They remind us that the human story began not with perfect heroes or flawless wisdom, but with ordinary choices made by two curious people trying to understand a mysterious world. Their lives were filled with beauty and mistakes, learning and regret, hope and reflection. And from those first complicated steps outside Eden, the entire history of humanity slowly began unfolding, generation after generation, all the way to the present day, where people still sit quietly listening to the ancient stories and wondering what lessons might still be hidden within them. And after the long lives of Adam and Eve faded into memory, the story of humanity continued moving forward through generations who slowly turned those early events into traditions, teachings, and written records. What makes the Ethiopian tradition especially interesting is not only the story itself, but the way these stories were preserved for such an incredibly long time. Because while many parts of the ancient world were constantly changing, rising kingdoms, falling empires, and shifting religious debates, the Christian communities in Ethiopia quietly developed one of the most stable manuscript traditions in history. For centuries, monks carefully copied religious texts by hand inside mountain monasteries, sometimes working in small rooms lit only by narrow windows or soft candlelight. The process was slow and patient. A single manuscript could take months or even years to finish. But that patience allowed many ancient writings to survive that might otherwise have disappeared completely. Among those preserved texts were books like Jubilees, Enoch, and the extended tradition surrounding Adam and Eve. In many other Christian traditions, these writings slowly faded away or were removed from official biblical collections as religious leaders debated which books should be considered authoritative. But in Ethiopia, the boundaries of the biblical canon developed differently. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church eventually recognized one of the largest biblical canons in the Christian world, containing 81 books. Some of those books were well known throughout Christianity, such as Genesis, Exodus, Psalms, and the Gospels. Others were far less familiar outside Ethiopia, including texts that expanded the earliest chapters of human history. The language used to preserve these manuscripts was Ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language that functioned somewhat like Latin in medieval Europe. By the time many of the manuscripts were copied, Ge'ez was no longer spoken in daily life, but it remained the sacred language used in church services and religious writings. This created an interesting situation where monks were copying stories that had been translated and retranslated across generations, each version carrying traces of earlier traditions from Hebrew, Greek, or other ancient sources. And within those pages, the expanded story of Eve's creation continued appearing in slightly different forms depending on the manuscript. Some copies emphasized the symbolic meaning of the rib story, explaining how the creation of Eve represented unity between human beings. Others focused more on the later adventures of Adam and Eve outside the garden, describing their struggles in the wilderness and their encounters with angels or spiritual adversaries. These differences were not necessarily seen as contradictions. Ancient readers often viewed them as complementary reflections on the same core story. In other words, the narrative was allowed to grow slowly over time as generations of writers added explanations or interpretations. The Ethiopian manuscripts, therefore, became something like a quiet library of early religious imagination, preserving not only the original biblical story, but also the centuries of thought that surrounded it. And this preservation happened largely because of geography and culture. Ethiopia's Christian tradition developed somewhat independently from the theological debates that dominated Europe and the Middle East during certain periods of history. While other regions were arguing intensely about which texts should be included in official Bibles, Ethiopian communities continued copying a wider collection of writings that had been circulating since the early centuries of Christianity. That does not mean every text was treated equally. Some books were read more frequently in church services while others were studied mainly by scholars or monks. But the important point is that many of these texts were never completely abandoned. They remained quietly preserved in libraries attached to monasteries that often sat high in the mountains or deep within remote valleys. Visitors who traveled to these monasteries sometimes described shelves filled with handwritten manuscripts wrapped carefully in cloth to protect them from dust and humidity. Some of those manuscripts contained stories that had not been widely read anywhere else in the world for hundreds of years. When modern historians eventually began studying Ethiopian biblical traditions more closely, they realized that these manuscripts offered a rare window into early interpretations of familiar stories. The creation of Eve was one of those stories that gained new layers of meaning through these preserved traditions. Instead of appearing as a brief moment involving a rib and a sleeping man, the Ethiopian texts sometimes treated the event as part of a much larger reflection on humanity's beginning. They explored questions about companionship, knowledge, curiosity, and the responsibilities that come with understanding the world. In that sense, the story of Eve became less about a single moment and more about the broader themes that shaped human history from its earliest chapters. The monks who copied these manuscripts may not have imagined that people thousands of years later would still be reading their work. For them, the act of copying sacred texts was simply a way of preserving wisdom for future generations. Each carefully written page represented hours of concentration and devotion. Ink was prepared by hand, parchment was shaped and smoothed, and every letter was written slowly to avoid mistakes. Over time, entire libraries of these manuscripts formed across Ethiopia, creating one of the richest collections of early Christian literature anywhere in the world. Today, scholars studying these texts continue discovering small details that shed light on how ancient communities understood stories like the creation of Eve. Some manuscripts include additional commentary written in margins by later readers. Others contain variations in wording that hint at older traditions behind the text. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of how the story traveled across centuries and cultures. And when we look back at the long path from the quiet Garden of Eden to the remote monasteries of Ethiopia, it becomes clear that the story of Adam and Eve has always been more than just a short passage in the opening pages of the Bible. It has been a living tradition, shaped by generations of storytellers, scribes, and thinkers who tried to understand what those early moments meant for the rest of human history. The Ethiopian manuscripts simply preserved more of those reflections than most traditions did. They allowed the story to grow slowly, accumulating layers of interpretation like rings inside an ancient tree. And in doing so, they kept alive a version of the narrative that still invites readers today to pause, listen carefully, and consider the quiet questions that have surrounded Eve's creation since the very beginning. And as generations of readers continued studying these ancient manuscripts, something interesting slowly became clear about the story of Eve's creation. The early storytellers were not only trying to explain what happened in the garden, they were also trying to understand what it meant for the rest of human history. In other words, the story was never just about a rib and a sleeping man. It was about relationships, responsibility, curiosity, and the strange balance between knowledge and innocence that humans have been trying to understand ever since. Many Ethiopian interpretations of the story, therefore, treated Eve's creation as a symbolic moment rather than simply a physical event. The rib taken from Adam's side was often explained as a reminder that human beings were designed to live in partnership rather than isolation. Ancient teachers sometimes pointed out that the rib did not come from Adam's head, which would suggest domination, and it did not come from his feet, which would suggest inferiority. Instead, it came from his side, close to the heart. For them, this symbolized companionship and shared responsibility. It was an idea that quietly shaped many later teachings about family and community. Another layer of interpretation focused on the timing of Eve's creation. As mentioned in some traditions, Adam spent a period of time alone before she appeared. Ancient thinkers believed this detail was important because it allowed Adam to experience the world by himself first. He explored the garden, named the animals, and observed the patterns of nature. Only after this period of learning did Eve arrive, bringing companionship into a world Adam had already begun to understand. Some writers suggested that this sequence symbolized the way human knowledge grows through cooperation. One person learns something, another person adds to that understanding, and together they build a larger picture of the world. In this sense, the story of Adam and Eve became a quiet metaphor for the development of human civilization itself. But the Ethiopian traditions also spent time reflecting on Eve's curiosity in the garden. Rather than portraying curiosity as purely negative, some manuscripts treat it as a natural part of human nature that simply requires wisdom to guide it. Eve's questions about the world showed a desire to understand creation more deeply. The problem was not the desire for knowledge itself, but the way it was pursued through the serpent's misleading suggestion. This interpretation allowed ancient readers to see the story as a lesson about balance. Knowledge is valuable, but it must be approached carefully and responsibly. Too much caution leads to stagnation, while reckless curiosity can lead to mistakes. Humanity's challenge is finding the middle path between those extremes. Interestingly, the Ethiopian texts sometimes portray Adam as slightly more passive during the famous moment with the forbidden fruit. Eve speaks with the serpent, considers the argument, and makes the first decision. Adam then follows her example. Some ancient writers use this detail to reflect on how influence works within human relationships. People rarely make choices completely alone. They are influenced by friends, family, and the conversations happening around them. In that sense, the story quietly reminds readers that every decision is shaped by the voices we choose to listen to. Over time, these interpretations turned the story of Eve into something much richer than a simple explanation of how the first humans left paradise. It became a reflection on the complexity of human nature itself. Humans are curious, creative, thoughtful, and sometimes impulsive. They search for knowledge but occasionally underestimate the consequences of their choices. And through experience, they slowly learn how to live with the results of those decisions. The Ethiopian storytellers believed this pattern began with Adam and Eve and continued through every generation that followed. Another theme that appears in several Ethiopian manuscripts is the idea of learning through hardship. Life outside the garden was difficult at first, but it also became the place where humanity developed skills, communities, and cultures. Farming required patience and planning. Raising families required cooperation. Building shelters required creativity. In other words, the challenges of the outside world forced humans to grow in ways that paradise never demanded. Some writers even suggested that the long human journey through history might eventually lead to a deeper understanding of creation than Adam and Eve possessed during their early days in Eden. It was a thoughtful way of viewing the story, not simply as a fall from perfection, but as the beginning of a long process of learning. The monks who preserved these traditions likely saw the same pattern in their own lives. Their daily routines were quiet and repetitive, copying manuscripts, studying scripture, tending small gardens near their monasteries. Yet through patience and discipline, they believed wisdom slowly developed. The story of Adam and Eve therefore felt strangely familiar to them. It was a reminder that human beings often learn their most important lessons through time, reflection, and sometimes even mistakes. By the time these interpretations had been written and copied across centuries, the story of Eve had become something like a mirror for human experience. Every generation could read it and see different meanings depending on the questions they were asking about life. Some readers focused on the warning about temptation. Others focused on the value of companionship. Still others reflected on the importance of seeking knowledge with humility. The Ethiopian tradition preserved all of these perspectives without insisting that only one interpretation was correct. And perhaps that is part of the reason these manuscripts continue fascinating historians today. They show how ancient communities engage deeply with their sacred stories, exploring the layers of meaning hidden inside them rather than reading them only at the surface level. Through careful reflection and storytelling, the brief moment when Eve was created from Adam's rib gradually expanded into a much larger conversation about what it means to be human. And even now, thousands of years after those earliest traditions were written down, people continue returning to the story with the same quiet curiosity that once led Eve to look more closely at the mysterious tree standing in the middle of the garden. And as the centuries slowly passed and Christianity spread across different parts of the world, another interesting chapter of the story began unfolding, not inside the Garden of Eden this time, but inside councils, churches, and libraries where religious leaders were deciding which book should officially belong inside the Bible. This process did not happen overnight. In fact, it took hundreds of years for different Christian communities to gradually settle on collections of sacred texts that they believed should guide their teachings. During those early centuries, there were many writings circulating among believers. Some were letters from early church leaders, some were historical narratives, and others were expanded stories explaining older biblical events, including the lives of Adam and Eve. Because of this wide variety of writings, different regions ended up preserving slightly different collections of books. In places like Rome, Constantinople, and later Western Europe, church leaders eventually narrowed the list down to a smaller canon of texts that they believed best represented the core message of Christianity. Books like Genesis, Exodus, the Psalms, the Gospels, and the letters of Paul became central parts of that canon. Other writings were gradually set aside. This did not always mean the texts were considered dangerous or forbidden. Often it simply meant they were viewed as helpful commentaries rather than official scripture. But once those decisions were made, many of the additional stories slowly faded from common use. Ethiopia, however, developed its Christian tradition a little differently. Christianity reached the region very early, around the 4th century, and the Ethiopian church grew somewhat independently from many of the theological debates happening elsewhere. Because of this independence, the Ethiopian biblical canon eventually included a larger collection of texts that had once circulated widely in the early Christian world. Among those texts were writings like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and extended traditions about Adam and Eve. In other parts of the Christian world, these writings gradually disappeared from regular use, but in Ethiopia, they remained part of the broader religious tradition. This difference sometimes leads modern readers to assume the Ethiopian Bible contains secret or hidden knowledge that other traditions tried to suppress. The reality is usually much simpler and far less dramatic. Most of these texts were never banned in a mysterious sense. They were simply not included in certain official canons when church leaders decided which books should be read regularly in public worship. Over time, that practical decision caused many of the writings to fall out of circulation in those regions. But the Ethiopian tradition continued preserving them through careful manuscript copying. Monks working in remote monasteries saw these texts as valuable reflections on biblical history, so they kept copying them along with the more widely recognized books. The result is that Ethiopian libraries today contain manuscripts representing an incredibly wide range of early religious thought. When historians began studying these collections more closely in modern times, they discovered that some of the preserved texts offered fascinating insights into how ancient communities interpreted familiar biblical stories. The creation of Eve was one of those stories that gained additional layers through these writings. Instead of appearing as a brief moment in Genesis, it became part of a larger narrative exploring the earliest days of humanity, the struggles of life outside Eden, and the lessons passed down through Adam and Eve's descendants. Scholars who study these manuscripts often describe them as windows into the imagination of early believers. They show how people thousands of years ago wrestled with the same questions many readers still ask today. Why were the first humans created the way they were? Why was knowledge both desirable and dangerous? Why do humans continue making mistakes even when they understand the consequences? The expanded stories about Adam and Eve did not always provide simple answers to those questions. Instead, they offered thoughtful reflections that helped readers explore the deeper meanings behind the biblical narrative. And because the Ethiopian Church preserved so many of these writings, modern historians now have access to a broader picture of how the story evolved across different cultures and centuries. It is a reminder that history is rarely as simple as a single official version of events. Stories grow, interpretations change, and different communities preserve different pieces of the larger puzzle. In the case of Eve's creation, the Ethiopian manuscripts quietly protected one of the richest collections of those early interpretations. They show how a short passage in Genesis inspired generations of storytellers to imagine the emotions, conversations, and lessons surrounding the very beginning of human life. For the monks who copied these texts, the goal was never to challenge other traditions or claim special secrets. Their work was simply an act of preservation, a quiet effort to keep the wisdom of earlier generations from disappearing. Each page they copied carried forward another piece of the ancient conversation about creation, knowledge, and the human journey through history. And because of their careful work, those stories still exist today, waiting patiently for modern readers to discover them again. And as we slowly reach the end of this long journey through the Ethiopian traditions about Adam and Eve, it becomes clear that the story was never meant to be a shocking mystery or a dramatic conspiracy hidden inside ancient manuscripts. Instead, it is something much quieter and far more human. It is a story about beginnings, about curiosity, about learning through mistakes, and about how generations of people tried to understand the strange moment when humanity first stepped into the world. The Ethiopian manuscripts simply preserved more of those reflections than most traditions did, allowing the story to unfold slowly across many layers of interpretation. When we look back at the earliest moment of Eve's creation, the simple image of Adam sleeping while a rib is taken from his side might seem almost symbolic in its simplicity. But for ancient readers, that small detail carried enormous meaning. It raised questions about companionship, about equality, and about why human beings seem naturally drawn toward one another rather than living in isolation. The idea that Eve came from Adam's side became a powerful metaphor in many traditions, suggesting that humanity itself was meant to exist through relationships rather than solitude. At the same time, the story of Eve's curiosity in the garden opened another conversation that has continued for thousands of years. Humans have always been curious creatures. They ask questions, explore unknown ideas, and sometimes step beyond the boundaries they were warned about. Ancient storytellers understood that curiosity could lead to both discovery and trouble. The conversation between Eve and the serpent therefore became a symbolic moment, representing the beginning of human choice. It was the moment when knowledge became something people could seek even when it carried consequences. The Ethiopian texts expanded this moment by exploring the lives of Adam and Eve after the garden, describing how they struggled, learned, and slowly adapted to a world that required patience and effort. These stories turned the brief Genesis narrative into something more reflective. Instead of ending the story with exile from Eden, the Ethiopian tradition continued following the first humans as they built families, faced tragedies, like the conflict between Cain and Abel, and watched the early generations of humanity begin spreading across the earth. Through these extended narratives, the story of Eve became part of a much larger reflection on human experience. Life outside paradise was difficult, but it was also where humanity developed creativity, responsibility, and the ability to grow through time. Another important part of this legacy lies in the way this story was preserved. For centuries, Ethiopian monks carefully copied manuscripts containing these traditions, protecting them inside monasteries where knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Their work was slow and patient. Each letter written on parchment represented a small act of preservation. Without that careful effort, many of these interpretations might have disappeared completely as history moved forward. Because of those manuscripts, modern historians can now see how different cultures approached the same ancient story with slightly different perspectives. Some focused on the symbolism of companionship. Others reflected on the dangers of temptation. Still others explored the idea that humanity learns wisdom slowly through experience. All of these interpretations grew from the same short passage in Genesis, showing how powerful even a small story can become when people continue thinking about it across centuries. And perhaps that is the most interesting part of Eve's story in the end. It has never stopped inviting reflection. Every generation reads it and asks new questions. Some wonder about the meaning of knowledge and innocence. Others think about the importance of relationships and shared responsibility. And many readers simply find themselves drawn into the quiet mystery of humanity's earliest days. The Ethiopian tradition reminds us that ancient stories were rarely static. They were living narratives shaped by conversation, interpretation, and imagination. When people copied manuscripts or told these stories to their children, they were not just repeating history. They were participating in a long cultural dialogue about what it means to be human. Eve's creation, therefore, became more than just a moment in the beginning of the Bible. It became a symbol of curiosity, companionship, and the complicated journey that followed when humanity stepped beyond the garden. From that point forward, the human story continued unfolding through countless generations, each one carrying pieces of the past while adding new experiences to the future. And somewhere within that long unfolding history, the quiet figure of Eve still remains, not simply as the first woman in an ancient story, but as a reminder of how curiosity, choice, and learning have shaped the human journey from the very beginning. And with that gentle reflection, the story slowly comes to rest, like the final pages of an old manuscript, closing softly after centuries of being read and remembered.